Thank you, Lindsay. So good morning, everybody. Since I'm still on the West Coast, so I'm going to say it's morning, but for those of you that are on the East Coast, good afternoon. So for those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Ryan Dinwiddie. I am the Chief Solution Architect at Beyond 20. I'm also a ServiceNow Certified Master Architect. I've spent almost the last 10 years or so working with ServiceNow, and the last kind of 4 or 5 of those have been specifically targeted around HR, and HR is kind of one of my passion areas. I like a lot of the HR practitioners. It's a really neat area to be in ServiceNow to have like a more impactful transformation, I think, of the user and employee experience. Mr. Joe.
Hey everybody, I am Joe Aranzullo. If you haven't met me before, I'm the Director of Service Delivery here at Beyond 20. I've been on ServiceNow about 10 years now, majority of that in the consulting space. Like Ryan, I also started on the client side. And over the years of my ServiceNow experience, I spent a good bit of time inside of HRSD. So I'm really excited to talk about it with you today, Ryan.
Yeah, and funny enough, Joe and I have actually worked a couple of HRSD projects together in a previous life.
That's right.
So that makes it a little more interesting. Okay, so today we're going to talk about an overview of what ServiceNow Human Resources Delivery or Service Delivery is. And that's just kind of like a very large umbrella at this point. We're going to talk about kind of the licensing structure a little bit to kind of give you a little bit of base information about what's included in kind of the 2 different licensing levels for HRSD. And then we're going to talk about kind of the like BFF type connection that exists between HR service delivery and, you know, whatever HCM, human capital management tool you're using in your environment. Kind of talk about, like, I want to spend a little bit of time on that because that's always an interesting topic, I think. And it's one of the ones that, like, when I'm doing an implementation, I get the most questions on, I think. And then kind of talking a little bit more about the Employee Center. And for those that aren't familiar, that's going to be that employee-facing portal within ServiceNow, how it's an employee-facing portal, but also a whole lot more. And we kind of want to talk about some like service delivery, so HR service delivery maturity models. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what the tool maturity looks like, as well as what the organizational maturity looks like, and how those kind of overlap with ServiceNow. And both Joe and I have got some great stories about some organizations that we've worked with and what that looks like for them. So for those of you that are not familiar, ServiceNow is what is affectionately called as the platform of platforms. So it's really kind of designed, and the push over the last couple of years from ServiceNow has really been to make ServiceNow be the system of engagement for your employees. So when we talk about those employees, we're not necessarily focusing on just the end user, just the employee point of view, or just the agent point of view. We're really talking about a combination of those two, kind of that holistic interaction. And we're going to kind of make that distinction a couple times today, where we talk about what does the HR, like, for lack of a better term, agent experience look like, and what does the employee experience look like on the other side of that. And again, fenced isn't necessarily a great word because it implies division, but on the other side of that aspect. But really, ServiceNow is more than just an IT tool. It's more than just, you know, a customer service tool. It is a platform that gives us the ability to kind of aggregate that user experience and, you know, kind of facilitate that work between other tools.
Yeah, you mentioned that, Ryan. I love how ServiceNow spread this out between IT workflows, customer workflows, employee workflows. For a long time, I'd be in an Uber headed to a customer site or something, or talking to someone, telling them what I do, and I explain ServiceNow, and they'd go, "Oh yeah, ServiceNow, I know that. That's that ticketing system, right?" Which made my heart hurt, obviously. But this perspective kind of changes the dynamic that ServiceNow isn't just that, and it can really optimize employee workflows as well as a lot more across the enterprise.
Yeah, and that's a good call out, Joe. And I think we're going to be having some of those conversations around kind of the bottom part of this slide, where it's showing like the system of record. And I think that's a really important distinction over the last couple of years with ServiceNow, is that it's designed to fit into the enterprise. It isn't necessarily the enterprise as a whole. Okay. So let's talk about what exactly human resources service delivery actually is, because again, I kind of mentioned the umbrella and we'll leave it at that, but we're going to dig in because when we talk about what exactly human resources service delivery is, the first thing that comes to mind for everybody probably is going to be case and knowledge management, because at its core, essentially, it is going to be a way for us to, record the support needs from our employees to be able to facilitate asks on their behalf, to be able to kind of manage the needs and asks that they have. And that knowledge is kind of twofold again, talking about the agent knowledge to be able to facilitate their job, allow them to resolve inquiries faster, but also having some of that knowledge available on the employee center. So kind of flipping the coin a little bit around what does that look like? So employees can self-serve, employees can answer their own questions. They don't necessarily have to open a case when they have a benefits question, because maybe we're able to self-serve that with a knowledge article, kind of reducing the workload on those agents a little bit, so they're able to provide a higher quality service with a lower number of cases. The next thing that's going to be a really big piece under that HRSD umbrella is the Employee Center. And the Employee Center, I like it. It's kind of gone through a couple iterations in naming from ServiceNow lately, but the Employee Center is really going to be that focus for employees, for end users. So I, as an end user, regardless of what kind of service I'm needing, and that's one of my favorite parts about it, is maybe my mouse is broken, then I'm going to go to the Employee Center. Maybe I have a question about payroll, I'm going to go to the Employee Center. Maybe it's freezing in my office and I need to put a ticket in for facilities, which is a real life use case for me today, except the facilities is me. So regardless of what I need as an employee, that's where I'm going, is the Employee Center. And kind of like the much larger supporting cast of characters when we talk about HRSD is going to be like virtual agent. So again, being able to provide some additional self-service interaction capabilities. We're going to dive into enterprise onboarding and transitions a little bit, because that is a very large topic. But that's essentially going to be driving more automation within our human resources organization. Performance analytics being in-platform analytics to provide us like real-time and metrics over time reporting, options around employee document management to be able to manage like the employee's electronic file, and both Joe and I've worked on like connections for those and projects for those where, that's kind of one of those overlap areas with HCM we'll talk about again a little bit later on. And one of the most amazing things that when we talk about HR service delivery is going to be that pre-built integration piece. So ServiceNow has put in a lot of investment the last couple of years into opening up for partners, for vendors, for themselves to build integrations. And building these integrations really gives us the ability to quickly start our connection to HCM, pull that user data in, populate what's going to be the HR profile that has that sensitive data potentially in it, and really kind of kickstart that connection right away. Okay, so kind of diving in a little bit deeper. So I want to talk about kind of the three different licensing levels, or really the two different licensing levels with ServiceNow. So there is a professional and an enterprise version of human resources. So kind of in the center core there, what you're seeing is everything that is core to that human resources, regardless of professional or enterprise licensing. These are the things that you're going to get. So talking about performance analytics, talking about, now mobile, talking about that case and knowledge, universal request, AI machine learning, those kinds of things are all available to us. But when we start to talk about professional, that's where we're going to have this kind of next arena.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really where the next step beyond core, this is where that scoped app comes in. COE is what you think of when you think of HRSD, case management, also HR knowledge, and then agent workspace, of course, employee center, which is a favorite topic of Ryan's and myself. See our webinar about that. Also, turning on a scoped application opens up a wide array of applications that are now available to you in the ServiceNow store. So now you can find what best fits your organization to accelerate your transformation.
In building on that, we've got kind of our next level. And I kind of like this kind of like additional side here, because it's so much bigger. So this is kind of what I meant in the beginning when I was talking about HR just being a very large umbrella. And we're going to kind of see how this evolved over time coming up next. But when we talk about the enterprise We're going to talk about how kind of the enterprise licensing ties in with some enterprise maturity a little bit later on. But essentially, we kind of shift our focus when we start to talk about enterprise away from, being reactive to our employees' needs to being more proactive with our employees' needs. And we see that kind of around like some of the journeys, some of the like different life cycle event pieces. So we're going to dig into those a little bit, but it's going to be more about like cultivating and nurturing our employees, having a kind of like an end-to-end connection from, from pre-hire process. So whether it's like applicant tracking tools all the way to, onboarding, to transitioning into a new role, to, like leave of absence, to eventually retirement, hopefully, and hopefully not the like bad, sad path of termination route. But wherever that employee's life cycle and journey is going to go, being able to kind of manage that life cycle, support that life cycle, and be proactive for them and be interactive with them. And also have some of this kind of be self-service again as well. And some of these are going to kind of depend on the organization for adoption. But for the most part, like a lot of these are going to be available and going to be used. So let's take a look at what human resources looks like over time. So Joe, I know that I think you started a little bit earlier in HR than I did, but I kind of started in the HR release somewhere around Helsinki, I think.
Yeah, I think my first HR engagement was Dublin, I want to say. And back in Dublin, it was more, not really an app per se, but more a HR table, something extended from task where you're trying to like, you replicate request management, but then put an HR spin on it. And then you have to obfuscate the data to abide by PII, to abide by FERPA or HIPAA or other regulations. It created a lot of technical debt with ACLs and before query business rules. But then once we get past that, once we get out to say Istanbul, the progression really takes off there. In Istanbul, it becomes a scoped application. It's that sandbox upon which to build the castle, which HRSD is today. And this was really the most impactful release since I had started at that point. And this is what gave us that COE structure. So it eliminated a lot of that tech debt, a lot of that kind of like, I don't know if I want to like customize the platform like this for you guys to accommodate this, but this kind of like opened up a world of possibilities. And it seems kind of odd for a developer to say this at the time, but the guided setup, because if you've been in ServiceNow a long time, if you've gone through the motion, set up things in other areas, it's easy to cut corners and missteps, but the guided setup that was available in Istanbul really made sure that I was completing everything sequentially for a successful deployment.
And I think that's a good point. I know that the other day when we were prepping for this, you and I were talking about kind of that ServiceNow webinar that was hosted. I don't remember exactly when, sometime 2017, 2018, when they were announcing that, probably 2017, that it was getting in, that they were turning human resources into a scoped application. And yeah. I remember being left wondering, like, what exactly does that mean? What does that mean for the future? And I don't think at that point I had much of an inkling of how much investment ServiceNow was going to be doing with human resources and how much focus it was going to get. Because I'll add the next build out in here. But when we talk about Jakarta, we talk about like the creation of EONT, which is Enterprise Onboarding and Transitions. We start to see like more influence from customer feedback with like bulk case creation. We start to talk about our first iteration of the pre-built Workday integration. A lot of portal enhancements. So I think that's one of those areas for me that's just huge with something like this. When you see it holistically, is all the different pieces and all the different customer feedback that ServiceNow has brought in.
Yeah, and then if you fast forward to London and Madrid, we get into the lifecycle event builder. Now, admittedly, when I would go into these workshops with customers, I would kind of like take my request management deck, I'd retrofit it, like, okay, we're going to make this about HR. And there was always some challenges, like trying to get the right requirements out to see what good looks like. But the lifecycle event builder, approaching it from that perspective, it helped HR business process owners see the forest through the trees and help us get to a good result sooner. And then, of course, virtual agent came on at that point. It wasn't widely adopted, especially with NLU, but it was started to get the bug in someone's ear, like, hey, this is a possibility for you. And if you adopt this now, the way ServiceNow prescribes, there are great things in store for you coming up.
And that's a good point. And I think when we talk about like New York, for me, one of the biggest mind blowers was mobile, because I've been working with multiple HR organizations at that point, and that was kind of one of the bigger asks from them was, when are we going to have mobile? When can we have mobile?
Yes.
And mobile came out, and it was awesome, but it wasn't quite what we needed yet. So there's going to be a couple more iterations of mobile that we're going to see throughout this. But that being said, it's still, New York was a really good release for us, because we're starting to add more and more automation in there as we go along.
Yeah, you mentioned mobile, and in Quebec, that brought on HR agent mobile as well, because not just employees, I mean, HR agents are also employees, right? So giving them that capability as well, and maturing mobile was like, it was a big selling point. Like, hey, you should adopt this and build this out in your organization. Along with that was AI search, which was huge, because at this point, the customers I was working with, they had already adopted HR. They were pushing people to the portal as a system of engagement, not snapping an email to someone, not chatting at someone. They were going to the portal, and AI search only further enhanced that. But if they were on Teams, now they opened up that possibility of, hey, I have an HR question. Hey, where's my W-2? They can just click a different conversation in Teams and blast that message off to an HR agent and get the answer they needed a lot quicker, versus context switching and all that, which is grossly inefficient.
Yeah, I agree. And we actually when we were prepping for this, I kind of had this little bit of a realization that there's like every 18 months or so, kind of since the beginning of 2013, ServiceNow has really incredibly advanced the HR product. And it's not one of those things that I had realized living it through the actual timeline. It's kind of like, when you binge a series and all of a sudden, things happen in very quick speed. It's not, it's not something I noticed at the time, but it really, every 18 months, we are seeing larger innovation. And ServiceNow has had a lot of contact with customers and larger HR organizations to say what's working, what's not working. And I like that you can kind of see the responsiveness.
Yeah, it felt like during those 18 months, I was catching the customers up to the current capabilities, and then like something amazing would happen. Like, okay, that's the next pie in the sky. Let's move to that. So yeah, the iterative success of ServiceNow and pulling out these features has been great.
And I think I've got one final thought on this before we move on, Joe, is like this slide is really, I think, more for me important to illustrate, like, if you're not on HR, like there's a lot that's already been built out. There's a lot that already comes with this. There's, I like the trajectory of this one, that like, clearly it's not going to level out anytime soon, that every family release, we're seeing some improvements, and then large improvements, fairly often.
Yeah, absolutely. I think back in Dublin, when I started, I could be a generalist. I can know everything about ServiceNow easily, but now you really have to have a core focus of like, I am an HR ServiceNow person, because the width of each capability of the platform is so wide now that there's a lot packed into it. Absolutely.
Okay, so with that, let's talk about the kind of diving in again a little bit more on Pro versus Enterprise. So the goal kind of coming out of this is, like, if you think about your organization, thinking about where you would necessarily fall into the line like Pro versus Enterprise, if you're not an existing HR customer. So that's kind of one of those things that would be the goal out of this. Is in HRSD Pro, we're really kind of providing some like intelligent capabilities, and we're providing workflows and giving people the ability, by people I mean agents, the ability to like kind of resolve common questions, and kind of work on like HR centric things. But it's very clear for those that have had even any sort of contact with HR that the employee life cycle is just barely like a kind of a smidge of HR. Like, I mean, it's important the fact that it starts with HR, it ends with HR, but a lot of things that happen in between, or even getting us to that kind of start and end point, HR has to partner with other parts of the organization. And when you start to have those partnerships, that's fantastic. But when those partners are on different tools, different processes, it becomes really time consuming and really expensive to be able to connect those two. So not having them on the same tool, not having them co-located, makes a little bit of a difference. So what we were talking about there is just kind of the pro capabilities to be able to have like case and knowledge management, employee centered, universal request. So this is going to cover a lot of kind of the standard, with air quotes, HR interactions. But if you're wanting to kind of step beyond the standard HR interactions and you're wanting to, help manage that employee life cycle from hire to retire, as opposed to like the opposite of that, you've got that ability. Or in the middle of your employee's journey, if they're wanting to, work on an advanced career path, promotion, needing to take a leave of absence, unfortunately, maybe disciplinary action, like all of those things, they have their own little workflows. And those own little workflows may not be in a tool, they may be kept in spreadsheets, some of it may be in the HCM. It just kind of depends on the organization, but those don't necessarily have a home sometimes. So being able to move some of those items into something like ServiceNow, having a pre-built life cycle for those, being able to manage those, I think that's really important. That becomes really powerful. And like I was going to try not to mention like COVID as an example on a webinar, because it's just, I've had that same problem with every webinar mentioning that. But when we talk about kind of like that human capital management connection, that HCM, being able to, we're kind of hopefully on the tail end of like the Great Resignation, right? But having that employee retention, I think, is directly tied to these enterprise capabilities. So if you're there and you're able to take care of your employees, you're able to manage their entire life cycle, have it all connected, like that's a huge incentive, I think, organizationally, and that's a big competitive edge.
Yeah, and HCM in this context is human capital management. When we think of that for this webinar, at least, we're thinking of those systems of record like Workday, SuccessFactors. I know, Ryan, you work with a bunch of other ones too. But I had a question from the outside in perspective for you, Ryan. Like, if I started out in HR Pro, like, what does it really take for me to go to enterprise? Like, if my HR org is that mature, like, how do I get there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Joe. And there's a jokey answer. I have to start over, but that's 100% kidding, right? I mean, like that's not realistic. And it's also not a great selling point. But kidding aside, that's one of the other things I love about this is it's a simple transition, because everything relies on, if you kind of remember that slide where we're talking about the like core piece, both professional and enterprise have the same core. So from the ServiceNow technical side, it's just kind of an additional plugin or two. From the employee side, there's not really any notice, both agent or employee. Like there's no data migration. There's none of that stuff. That's one of the things I love about it. Is it's almost like a turn on and go sort of, or turn on and configure.
Now, if I took a step back from that, if I didn't have anything, where would you recommend someone like just getting to this capability in the platform? Where would they start? Like, how do I know what's right for me?
Oh, that's a good question. And I get to give you my favorite consultant's answer of it depends. Of course. And the reason I say it depends, and we'll talk about the maturity stuff in a little bit, because in my mind, it 100% determines like how much of the 3 T's you have, right? Time, talent, and treasury, but also how much capabilities you have within your organization to be able to adopt things. So if your services aren't 100% defined and your service offerings aren't quite there, your workflows aren't quite there, it may not necessarily be worth the investment. And I realize how that sounds coming out, but like as a cost savings measure, it may not necessarily need to be that you need to jump right to enterprise. It could be that we use core to advance the foundational functionality, and then in another 12, 18, 24 months, or depending on whatever timeline fits, advance to that enterprise. So in short answer, Joe, is I don't know that there's a one size fits all for that. So
sure. And that being considered, if I reverse it, how do I know I'm ready to go adopt this? Like, what are the things I need, organizationally speaking, to be ready to adopt even HRSD Pro or Enterprise?
A really good question. I mean, adopting HRSD Pro, I would say that everyone, I mean, essentially everyone is ready. There's a little caveat there of like, if nothing's documented, like that's always a great first step, right? To know what services you're offering. But if you've got kind of a rough idea of like the services you're offering,
Mhm.
metrics around those services, overall service delivery, like those kinds of things, great place to go to Pro. And if you feel like you've mastered Pro and you're ready to start being more proactive with your employees, I would say Enterprise is the next step.
Okay.
So great questions, Joe. Okay, so one of the things that I kind of want to talk about is where is, and for lack of a better term, again, where's the line between human resources service delivery and human capital management systems? So that this is also gives me the opportunity to use my favorite consultant answer of it depends, because I have never had two customers have the same exact line,
No,
because it, sorry, Joe, go on ahead.
no, I was agreeing with you. It's they could use the exact same platforms and tools, but have very different journeys, and yeah, it changes every time.
And I mean, one of the biggest examples that I can think of, an easiest one is, taking a customer that has like a Workday HCM. Do they do their onboarding in the Workday module? Do they do it in iCIMS? Do they do it in Taleo? Like all these things directly impact that kind of line between HR and HCM, HRSD and HCM. That's just one example of how we can kind of move that needle a little bit. So that's where it's always going to be part of the conversations around what's going to be the best and what is the kind of like what's the expected employee experience coming out of that.
Yeah, not just that, but also how mature they are in that platform. Like I've had Workday customers just stand it up, and I've had folks that have been on it for a very long time, and that greatly, like you said, it depends on how they interrelate with ServiceNow.
Yeah, and I think you have a fun history there with one project that we worked on together where Workday was getting stood up at the exact same time, and it was kind of a
Yes.
not really a race to the end, but there was definitely a lot of risk in that project because of tight
Hmm.
timelines to stand up an HCM and an HRSD at the same time.
Yeah, I'll speak to that in a little bit.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about where so we know that you need an HCM. Right. That's kind of going to be the constant message of this is that ServiceNow is not a replacement for HCM. HCM is not a replacement for ServiceNow. And I think that's kind of one of the things I want to be very transparent about is so very few, and if any, like 100% completely done processes are completed within HR. So I think that's an important note here of if the process isn't completed within HR, what happens to the things that aren't completed within HR? So taking something as I want to say simple, right? But as fairly simplistic as like a job change. Not to minimize the amount of work that goes into something like a job change, but from the job change, there is again potentially facilities, right? So facilities may need to come in if somebody's actually in the office. If you're on your couch, facilities not needed, right? But like maybe phone numbers need to change, or physical phone needs to change. Maybe telecom needs to be involved. Access needs to change potentially depending on if I'm changing departments. And HCM tools need to run. Like we need to update department information. Maybe that needs to flow into finance tools. Maybe that needs to, like, there's a whole bunch of things that kind of spider out into the organization. And that's one of those good examples of if everybody is on the same tool and on the same platform, then that significantly cuts down the number of integrations that we have to do. That if we're using some sort of HCM, we've just got our single connection to HCM, assuming HCM is connected to finance tools. If facilities, if telecom, if IT, those areas are also in ServiceNow, we can kind of manage that life cycle of that request and then, generate what needs to happen, keep track of that, keep everything in system of record, and also provide managers that transparency through the employee center.
Yeah, and you mentioned that. I think about employees may not necessarily need HR support precisely. You mentioned facilities, telecom, all that, but just the level of care and feeding they need before they actually get to what facilitates an HR transaction. When I was, you mentioned that client I worked with earlier. When I started out with them, they had like everyone has this the HR at companyname.com, ask HR mailbox, or in my case, in the previous company, I had to reach out to like the Ryan of the company. Hey, Ryan, I have a question on payroll. I have a question on this, on that. And knowing who specifically to call, or Ryan does take days off occasionally, but not too often. But if they aren't around, then that only slows me down in getting resolution to my question, which may actually be just self-service. Not only is this grossly inefficient, but it's also very costly because Ryan has a lot of other things going on that I am drawing him away from to ask this question. I could just, if I had ServiceNow and I had this rolled out, I could go answer the question myself.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Joe. And we're in this together, I think is a good way to think about it. Is,
Yes.
Connected employee experiences require other systems, other departments, other teams. Like, I think everyone's been through over and over again. There's probably an example in your head right now of like how disconnected systems fragment that user experience. So thinking about it from the employee, without having little guidance or offering them little guidance saying, well, you should have known that you needed to go to this tool to do this X, Y, and Z thing, for your job transfer. That's not great employee experience, right? And it's not a good way for employees to feel like they're connected and part of the organization. So it's kind of an important note that, like, when we're really wanting to talk about that holistic experience of everything I do is in one or two tools, like, that's a significantly different experience than like having this kind of process happen in 6 different places or things. Very like nondescript example there, but I think everyone's kind of got something in their head that they're thinking about that has just not been a pleasant experience. Okay. So again, we're just kind of wanting to talk about this one, and I'll pass this guy off to Joe.
Yeah, you even just mentioned unifying things on one platform or creating, I refer to it as, like, there's an interaction where I'm talking to a person, there's a transaction where I'm flipping a flag on someone's record. HCM is a great example of that. HCM, Workday, success factors, what have you. Great example of system of record. I can say, oh, Joe now works here, or Joe's new direct manager is this person. But where ServiceNow specializes is that system of interaction, that one-stop shop. And most employee interactions, like, I might have a question of, hey, where do I go to find information on ... That doesn't require a transaction on the HCM's part or a transaction even on the service desk's part. That could be solved by self-service, via a knowledge article. But a lot of employees find that contacting employees, oh, hey, when I onboarded, Ryan had all the answers. He may not be the SME on the thing, but he could point me in the right direction. Reaching out to that person. And like I said before, this is super inefficient. Now you're asking Ryan to go reach out to someone else, find the answer to reach out to someone else that might be out to lunch or something. And that's just creating cost and time loss for your employees. So we want to unify this service, and we built out with this that where do I find X? I know in my own browser, I have like 7 or 8 bookmarks to the various systems we have to find the question to some answer I have today. Now, if I brought that into ServiceNow, for instance, now instead of making sure I had the right bookmarks or I got that one nugget of knowledge from someone, I can just walk into my ServiceNow Employee Center and say 401k and get that same exact service I would get much sooner, but from one platform. Especially when this comes to like employee lifecycle, onboarding, that's something I've dealt with quite a bit as director of service delivery, and seeing the vital importance of that, of having a consistent, timely onboarding process across the enterprise, because failure to onboard someone properly means they're ill prepared to do their best work, which is why you hired that person in the first place. And the same can be said for transfers, for promotions and terminations. It's vitally important that those proper steps are followed each time, and that you have some record that was completed as well. And that's where ServiceNow comes in, as with the power of a platform. We can integrate that, where in my HCM, I said, oh, Joe now reports to so-and-so, or Ryan is moving to here, or whatever. Like, that's all well and good, but unifying it under the platform, I can leverage that data out of my HCM to empower my employee workflows, my IT workflows, customer workflows, accelerating my time to value to say, like, hey, this used to be an email or a cubicle knock or something like that, where now it's all automated, leveraging the data I already have.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, so let's talk about what the kind of agent experience looks like for ServiceNow. So when we've got our agents, and our agents, again, I'm going to use some kind of generic like agent terminology. So those that are HR fulfillers, for lack of a better term, but those could be like HR tier 1, they could be tier 2, or it could be moving over towards like a specialized area where we're talking about benefits, payroll, employee relations, all the different areas that exist within HR. They're all going to be interacting with ServiceNow, and they're all going to kind of be using ServiceNow as their system of engagement. And it's really important to note that all of this, the kind of like aggregated experiences, is keeping that agent within something like ServiceNow. So regardless of whether they need payroll data from ADP, whether they need to pull into like a human capital tool, the idea being is that we're keeping that employee there, as opposed to having them, like, for lack of a better term, again, swivel chair, even though we don't actually spin our chairs anymore, hopefully not, to be able to like go into Workday and look up a beneficiary, look up an emergency contact, or somebody has a question on their last paycheck, or they want to know when their next pay date is. Those are good examples of data that we could very easily pull into ServiceNow and either expose to the portal or through the portal to the employee, or have it be available for the agents in kind of a restricted fashion to be able to see some of that, and have that data be available without having to have somebody switch screens, switch switch tools, switch applications, and kind of increase their efficiency a little bit. Joe, do you have some real world examples you wanted to talk about there?
Yeah, I think Ryan alluded to this earlier. I worked with that large medical device company I mentioned before, and not only were they starting out in their ServiceNow journey, they were also starting out with their HCM journey at the same time. This was kind of a unique experience for me as the consultant coming in, and it was a lot of fun actually, because doing this in unison, we could play off each other's strengths. Like, hey, what's best? What does ServiceNow need to accomplish the best result of? Or how do I have to structure my HCM in order to do ... And this is where we like brought those two things together. Another integration we had outside of HCM was DocuSign. As being a medical device company, there's a lot of compliance and regulations. So having things like e-signature was very helpful in that process to help streamline it and get things off of literal wet signatures. I remember before we went live, I would have to get a document, print it, sign it, scan it, send it, many steps along the way. So even I, as a consultant, saw the value straight away. We ended up deploying an MVP for this customer at first in one region of the world. And then we built upon that success as we continued to go to the next location, the next business unit, until all across it was unified under one portal. So
yeah, and sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Did you have one, Ryan? I thought you had one as well.
Not as much for this one. I was just going to chime in that, like, when you think about the efficiency for the agents, and like agents not having to swivel chair into other tools or streamlining those processes, like Joe was mentioning for signatures, kind of freeing those agents up to provide a better quality of service, and to have kind of a lower volume of tickets. So that's kind of one of the other things that I've worked with organizations in the past, is the desire to not adjust staffing levels, but just to have better care for employees as they're coming in, and have more time and attention spent on HR cases. So,
yeah, I think what really made the engagements Ryan and I were involved in successful was providing that single portal and single system of engagement. In a previous webinar, we had talked about adopting ServiceNow across the enterprise. And a lot of that was adoption. Like, Ryan and I could come in and build you whatever you want, no problem. But if nobody adopts it, what's the point? So even though they can't be employee facing, your HCM systems are really designed for the HR users first. And then there are obviously some accommodations for the occasional employee to come in and do something, which is in sharp contrast to ServiceNow, which is meant as a system of engagement to let the platform integrate with those HCM systems and give a simple, consistent experience to your employees.
And that's a great segue, Joe, of like flipping at this, looking at it from the employee side, right? ServiceNow is going to be all about meeting our employees where they are. So again, not mentioning the C word in a webinar, with everybody still kind of halfway working at home, some of us working from beaches if we're lucky enough, right? And I'll put in Joe's case as like working on a beach. But regardless of the device, regardless of the interaction, right? Being able to do that from mobile, from tablet, from a satellite hotspot in the middle of a jungle somewhere, hopefully not, but being able to kind of aggregate all those user experiences again from the employee side, and the employees not having to go into other tools, other applications. So agents that are responding to them are in the same tool. Employees are guided to the right place, and integrations sync between those two systems. So again, employees may not know, and probably should never know, that there are all these other tools kind of on the right that they might be interacting with. As far as they're concerned, they're in ServiceNow, they're in the employee center, they're in the consistent branded themed environment. So they see that, they feel that it's a unified experience for them. But there's all this other stuff that's supporting that kind of interaction and that seamlessness. And I think this is definitely a large goal for some organizations, and some are working on it, some have succeeded, some it's kind of a never-ending process. Okay. So Joe and I kind of put our heads together and had kind of a little bit of a key takeaway, because this is a really important piece. I think when we talk about where the line is between ServiceNow and the relationship between ServiceNow and whatever human capital management tool you're using. So this is one of my biggest ones, is that employee experience is not just HR, right? I mean, it sounds silly to say, but it's one of those things that can sometimes need to be said out loud to be acknowledged, that HR may drive a lot of the workflows on this, but they need to cooperate, and we need to have cooperation from the other areas within the organization to be able to provide that good employee experience that we're looking to be in service of. And complex, multi-department workflows, and a good example of that is on offboarding, leave of absence. They require something like ServiceNow to be able to kind of quarterback all those interactions, manage the records, manage the workflow from all those areas, being able to be available anywhere, anytime. And when we talk about like ServiceNow delivering or organizations adopting and delivering human resources service delivery through ServiceNow, we talk about like more than 1,600 customers. ServiceNow worked with Forrester to understand the time savings, and they've got some estimates on time savings there. One of the biggest ones that always stands out to me is like just the increase in productivity. So we're able to take our agents and have them do more, and while kind of simultaneously like freeing up additional time. So those, just as an example, like on an annual basis, 10,000 hours, that's a lot of time that can be reinvested into our other employees, reinvested into the HR agents, building skills, those kinds of things. I would hope that wouldn't immediately be a thought of like a potentially cost savings ROI, because that's one of the reasons I love HR so much, is that's a latter thought on some of the focuses.
Yeah, Ryan, you mentioned that. I know with the current state of the economy right now, with folks looking for those efficiencies, leveraging the platform to make their current staff 30% more productive, to free up 10,000 hours, that can provide what they need. They don't need to open up a new rec tomorrow to hire a whole bunch of people to get things done. Another key takeaway for me was about ServiceNow being providing enterprise-wide workflows. I mentioned the example of explaining my job to people, and people saying, "So, oh, ServiceNow, that ticketing system." It's really much more than that. It's enterprise-wide workflows, and some of those workflows underpin your HR processes, where your HCM is just the system of record, but ServiceNow provides a unified experience. Again, back to thinking about interactions of employee with agent versus just transactions like changing a field on a record. Then we went into the evolution of the HRSD platform within ServiceNow. It's pretty incredible. I don't feel like I've been on ServiceNow very long. Maybe I'm just having too much fun, but having ServiceNow remaining focused on evolving the service and employee experience further, whereas HCM platforms like a Workday or SuccessFactors, they might have competing priorities in the roadmap, and employee experience isn't always at the forefront. And then I think I belabored this one, unifying under one platform. I can't say that enough. Instead of playing a game of telephone, I call Ryan Rankle, someone else, to try to get me the answer I need, and just taking that inefficiency and creating a cost savings instead. ServiceNow being built for employees, ServiceNow becomes that thing I reach out to when I have a general question, and it saves me a ton of time. Maybe I can help myself, or Ryan is better armed with the best answer to give me when I reach out to him.
So included in HRSD Pro and Enterprise are various levels of the Employee Center. And Joe and I had, as Joe had mentioned a little while ago, we had a very specific Employee Center webinar, but I want to dig into this really quickly, just as kind of a reminder if you weren't able to attend that one as well. So when we talk about Employee Center, there is the Employee Center and the Employee Center Pro. So when we talk about the Employee Center, this is going to kind of be the base. And for those of you that may not have seen it yet, this is definitely a different look and feel to the previous kind of like predecessor of this, which is the Employee Service Center. And we and a lot of other partners were finding that the Employee Service Center was getting configured in a way that we would have to like continually expand it into IT, expand it into other areas because it had such great capabilities. So ServiceNow responded to that and created the Employee Center, and it truly is kind of a multi-department service delivery page. So I don't know if you can kind of see in the screenshot at the top left there, each sort of like area within where you're serving your employees, that's all going to be like available within that portal as well. And then included in the enterprise licensing is the Employee Center Pro, and that Employee Center Pro is going to look a little bit different and have a little more capabilities because again, it needs to be able to support what a lot of the organization needs when we're rolling out those enterprise level items, such as the journeys and those kinds of things where we need a little bit more of like a, for lack of a better term, a heavier duty portal to be able to support a lot of that. So Joe, I know that we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit.
Sure.
And spend a little bit of time on the maturity models, because I think this is one of those things that I was really interested in, and it's one of those things that you and I collaborated on quite a bit to talk through. So it's one of the things I want to make sure I get to.
Sure.
All right, so I want to talk about tool maturity and I want to talk about organizational maturity. So when we think about maturity within some sort of thing, right, it can also be kind of described as like the crawl, walk, run, fly approach. Depending on how you view this, it really kind of allows us to take a step back and be less reactive and more proactive. So when we start to talk about like the tools that we see in HR organizations that kind of are like on the lower end of the tool maturity scale, we see those that are maybe using like a legacy tool. Maybe they're using like a customized or configured like ITSM tool that's specifically for HR. Maybe all that work is getting handled out of a shared mailbox. There may not be a human capital, or it may not be integrated into case management. The services that HR is offering may be limited. The processes may be undocumented, and it's kind of hard to report on all of this jumble. So I think that's kind of the point, and kind of the key summary of this is if you don't know what's going on, like you can't manage what you can't measure. So if you don't have SLAs involved because you've got a shared mailbox, if you don't have any idea how many cases the agents are processing on a daily basis, it's hard to be able to manage their jobs and help them with their jobs a little bit better if we're unsure of that. So one of the things that we start to see on those that have more kind of advanced tool maturity is, advanced applications, something like ServiceNow. HCMs that are built out, functional, and integrated. We see that processes are mapped, and we see that they extend beyond HR. We are no longer being reactive in the organization to what fires are popping up. We've got the ability to be proactive, and we're focusing on self-service and automation. We're meeting those employees, and we're focusing on kind of that employee engagement and interaction.
Yeah, you talk about this, Ryan. I think back to the example I shared before, rolling out HCM HR at the same time. And that's exactly where they started, was that shared mailbox. Every request was like that general request of, I have a thing I need, read on to find out more. And what we were able to do with the team when we were deploying both HCM and HRSD was take a lot of that institutional knowledge out of people's heads. And this company had HR service desks across the world, and bring all those processes into standardization and then eventually automation. So at the same time, we were deploying Employee Service Center because we're back in London and New York release, as well as HR Knowledge, was help the employees help themselves, which took some of the onus off those HR service desks globally. And like you said, Ryan, increased productivity, free up some man hours and all that.
Yeah, and speaking of the organizations, let's take a look at that. So we're going to kind of follow the same or similar kind of, stretch across the top where we're starting to look at, how are we managing things within the organization? And initially, I think a lot of folks kind of start, and a lot of organizations kind of start in this sort of like managed area where we're managing the services. We're mostly reactive, like anything that's mission critical is met, but cases and processes may be fragmented. We might have inaccessible data. We might be not really aligned with, and we might still be defining the business needs. Moving into kind of that managed area where we're talking about being kind of a planned organization where, our items are locally managed. We're starting to build relationships between the organizations. We're starting to kind of dip the toe into automation a little bit. Maybe we're workflowing some of our cases. This kind of potentially frees us up to be a little more employee focused. And maybe that starts to allow HR to be kind of a marketed capability of like, we have this great HR organization. It's, it's a draw to the organization, and it's kind of a bonus to the employees. So from there, we start to talk about being proactive, right? This is really going to kind of be all about competencies, right? So understanding who's doing what within the organization, and not just like HR employee competencies, but talking about, competencies within the organization itself, and starting to tie into like kind of some IT maturity where we're starting to talk about like role-based access, those kinds of things, because that all kind of circles back to the employee competencies, the standardization of that data. And then starting to have some transparencies, and HR starting to support the business strategy. From there, we're starting to be more integrated. We're starting to have succession planning. We're starting to have kind of like the HR development is aligning with the business. We're starting to bring in more employee ownership, accountability, and engagement. And then on the optimized, like HR then becomes a trusted business partner. And our solutions are starting to become predictive. And there's a reason I think like integrating talent management is kind of one of the ends, because it's one of those things that like talent management is great, but because it requires so many other things to align in the organization to get somebody from talent management to hire, it's kind of on the higher end of the maturity model. But the HR organization is going to then be like flexible and customized to kind of meet the organizational needs.
Yeah, looking at this, I just want to call out that like done may not always be optimized for your organization. It's certainly not something I see commonly happen in like 1 or 2 releases. There's a lot more to it than turning on ServiceNow, turning on some plugins, following a guided setup. There's a lot of internal process alignment that goes into it as well. So when taking this on, you want to keep small bites in mind. Iterative success beats delayed perfection every time. Working with a customer that had to stand up their HR org, we just took this to the manage block or initial from the above arrow, and then we built on that success as we rolled out globally. So definitely don't try to boil the ocean in this case.
And I think that's a great point, Joe. And it's good to note that like this is not, this is by no means not a perfect model. This is just what we've worked with and what we've seen in organization specific. And not every process is necessarily going to be at the same level. So the organization as a whole may have that, but individual processes may roll up into certain parts of these too. Because maybe, for example, like when we get into integrated, maybe we just stall out there the business process because there isn't the capabilities, there isn't the tools, there isn't, it's going to cost us $100 million to do this integration. Like you could hire a lot of people to do whatever manual work needs to be done, right?
Yes.
That's just a massive exaggeration, but there are areas where this may not ever get to completion, which is fine, right? It's always continual improvement is always it's always a goal. It's not a target, right? You're not going to get there and be like, oh, we're done. Everybody can retire now. That would be nice, but things are always changing.
Of course.
Okay, so I know that we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to say thank you, but I did want to call on Lindsay if there was any questions that kind of bubbled up in the chat, or anything else that Joe and I can answer in the next few minutes.
Sure, thank you. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and use that chat panel in the 2 minutes we have, or the chat. I have a question for you. Oh, I should say marketing things first. So you can see here on the slide, we've got a ton of resources available to you guys, not limited to HR, but from ServiceNow to IT best practice. We've got a really in-depth blog that we're super proud of. We've got some HR stuff covered there. And we also have resources. You can see here some white papers. We've got all kinds of templates and assessments and different kinds of things that you can engage with there. And then, of course, we have a YouTube channel. We've got ServiceNow tutorials for the practitioners who just need simple questions answered. How do I do this quickly in ServiceNow? We also have a bunch of webinars just like this with Joe and Ryan and some of our other experts talking about ServiceNow and all kinds of good stuff. So yes, I think with that, I'll save my question for Slack later. For you guys, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you, Ryan and Joe. Thank you to everybody who joined us today right ahead of the holidays. Have a wonderful holiday season and a lovely Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.